Pulsex and Pulsechain are going to be out very soon. And I received this question in regards to providing liquidity for Pulsex. And it wouldn't make a ton of sense as an LP to this person when you factor in impermanent loss. And I wanted to dive into that. So I've put together two examples here so we can actually walk through exactly what is impermanent loss and why it may or may not make sense to do. And then just give you more of like the economic kind of reasoning behind why it actually does make sense. So with that being said, if this is your first time here, what's up? My name is Sam, and for those of you who are returning, it's good to frickin' see you. If you're returning, I don't know why you didn't already smash that like button. So this is good. I like the questions because this forces me to continue to learn and to continue to grow so that I can understand something enough to be able to articulate it in these videos. I got this question over on Twitter, by the way. Twitter link down below if you want to jump over there and say what's good. Also, there's some other links down below if you want to support the channel. If y'all would ever have somebody on your morning show to talk about some of the Pulsex questions, I'd also be interested to hear about impermanent loss by LPs if the price is just going to be bought up forever. Wouldn't make a ton of sense as an LP to me. I still wasn't a fan of the answers I've received on Twitter or seen on Twitter. So I wanted to dive into that, right? Like what is the impermanent loss, right? Because I plan on providing liquidity, maybe not with, Pulse or Pulsex, depending on, where I'm at, but maybe so, depending on the pair. So to do that, I wanted to put together an example of like the ratios of this because that'll give us the baseline. And then we use that baseline to actually take a look at a specific example of what the loss actually might be under a certain scenario. And then we're going to talk about, say, the economic reason, like, does it actually make sense to do something like that? So in this example, we're going to say that Pulse is 1 cent and Pulsex is 1/10 of a cent, 0.001, right? And that means for every 10 Pulsex, there's 1 pulse, right? And if somebody wanted to provide liquidity, and so when you're putting up liquidity on generally speaking, there's on V3 Uniswap, I believe that there's single-sided liquidity, which if you want to see a video on single-sided liquidity, let me know and we can try to figure that out as well. But when you're putting up liquidity, you're going to provide some of each side, right? Because it's not, we're thinking about it as Pulse or Pulsex, but when you think about what liquidity is, it is effectively removing, say, Coinbase or Kraken or Binance from the equation. So in the Coinbase example, or Binance or any exchange, they're taking the fees, right? So they would be doing this. So you're effectively eliminating those, and instead of Coinbase getting the billions of dollars in fees, now people who want to put their own money in there can earn a return. But it's not Pulse or just Pulsex. It's what pool. You think about it as like an entirety, right? So you have Pulse and Pulsex. You have to put both of those things in the pool together, and you're going to put them in equal amounts. You've probably seen this example here before, or what this is. Let me make this, right? X times Y equals K. And this is how AMMs work, automated market makers. So that is the quantity of X times the quantity of Y, where X is Pulse and Y is Pulsex in this example, equals K is a constant. So K is going to stay the same, period. So K, if there were more people in this liquidity pool, then this number would be different, right? Than this, right? So say if like I was doing this, right, and I'm putting up 10,000 Pulse and 100,000 Pulsex to this, then that's $100 of each coin, right? So I'm putting up an equal amount, even though quantities are different because the prices are different. When you look at this, this is just what that formula says. This is the constant, right? X times Y equals K. It's just what is 10,000 times 100,000, right? That's what this number is. Now, when somebody comes to the pool and they're like, hey, Sam, I would like to exchange 1,000 Pulse X for Pulse. What does that actually do when you look at the algebra? Pretty simple, right? So that's what this is here. So if you do the math in reverse, right? X, and we're just solving it for X over here, right? X is going to be Pulse, as we talked about. What that means, this is the new quantity of Pulse. We're taking 1,000 Pulse X, and we're going to exchange it for Pulse. And to do that, because this is just a formula, we're just following the math on this. Let me pull this up here. We get to see that the constant, right, we're not changing that. The K value in the equation doesn't change at all. That's what the constant means. It just means it's constantly level, right? So that's going to stay the same. We're going to add 1,000 to Pulse X, right? Because somebody's like out here, they're going to come into the pool, they're going to add 1,000 Pulse X, right? So Pulse X is going to go from 100,000 to 101,000. Now, you take the constant divided by the new value, the 101,000, and that's going to give us the other, as in that's all this is saying right here. X equals K constant divided by Y. Y is the 101. That gives us a value of Pulse, the new quantity, of 9,901. And again, over here, this is the Pulse X, is 101,000. Because somebody brought that to the pool. That leaves this to be the same, right? So we know that this number here, after the trade, has to stay the same. It's going to stay the same no matter what. So the constant before is going to stay exactly the same after. So that means the ratio has to change between these two. So if we remember back up here, and then we're going to get into the example so you get to see exactly how this works. But you need to understand this to be able to understand the example. So in this example, right, we had 10 Pulse X equals 1 Pulse. But now it's different, right? You have the ratio is different. And all this is just dividing these two into the other. It's not 10 for 1 anymore. It's 10.2010 is for 1 Pulse. So it's effectively changing the price. But let's take a look at this example. Let's assume that we did this. We put this money in here and we are the sole provider into this liquidity pool. If you're not the sole provider into this liquidity pool, then it would just be representative of a fraction of the total pool. For example, if I put in this, you put in this, and 8 of our other friends put in this amount, right? Then we would just add another 0 onto this, or 2 zeros, or whatever that came out to be, right? And I would represent 10% of the total pool in this example. But we're going to assume that I'm the only liquidity provider in here. Now, remember how Pulse was 10 cents? Well, let's just assume, I'm sorry, I think it was 1 cent. It was 1 cent. So now it is 2 cents. It's doubled in value. So this is where we're going to get to the impermanent loss that he mentioned here. But the price of Pulse X changed. So what do we know about those ratios, right? We already saw that we went from 10 to 1, right? From 10 to 1, meaning 10 Pulse X for 1 Pulse. Now we changed it by 1,000. Somebody brought in 1,000 Pulse X for Pulse, and that changed the ratio. So it was 10.2 Pulse X for every 1 Pulse. Well, when the price increases, right, of the Pulse, let's take a look. So in order for you to have that magnitude of a price difference, 41,000 would have to be changed in this example, right? Pulse X for Pulse. So that gives us these numbers here. So we have 7,000 Pulse left after 41,422 was exchanged. That gives us Pulse, which if you look at this, all this is the Pulse. Wait a second. This should just be 100,000. Yes, this is 100,000 right here, plus this number right here. So we have 100,000 Pulse X. 141,000 Pulsex, which allows this has to stay the same. Remember that. That's why this is why math is pretty easy, right? These two, the constants before the trade and after the trade are the same. But there's a new ratio. The new ratio is 20. That means there's 20 pulse, and it's pretty easy to see. It's 20 versus over here, it was 10. 10 Pulsex for 1. Now it's 20 for 1. So let's take a look at this impermanent loss. So we have over here, these are the new numbers after this has taken place. Right now the price of Pulsex has shot up because you can see that he understands it here. Bought up forever, like in terms of the price of one side is going to be going up, that's going to create impermanent loss, right? So let's take a look at this. We just saw the price double for Pulse, so the value in this pool is going to stay the same, right? This is just the formula from the previous page. The value in here is going to stay exactly the same. So we have to have the same amount in each one, and we know that because if we multiply these two times each other, it equals this, right? So we have $141 of Pulse and $141 of Pulsex. So the total amount is $282 versus if we came back over here, we started with 200. So we just made $82, right? We're like, well, you're making profit. So what is impermanent loss? Well, it's the opportunity cost. If we had just held, right, if we had taken 10,000 and 100,000 of each and just held those, then what would the value be? So we come over here, 10,000 times the new price and 0.001 cent times the quantity for Pulsex would give us $300. So if we had just held on to our position and not provided liquidity, we would have $300. Because we provided liquidity, we have $282. So you're like, well, why would I want to do that? Right? And we're going to get into the economic reasoning in a moment. Why would I want to do that? Because you're like, I'm $17 short, right? Like I lost $17. Why would I ever want to do that? Well, the fees are why. So in this example, we have 41,422 times the price of Pulsex that was coming into it. So when you look at, say, Pulsex, the fees on here are 0.29%. So that's what this value right here is, 0.029%, times the quantity times the price, right? It becomes $1.02. So the fee on, if this all happened in one transaction, then the fee would be $1, and you're like, well, it's still going to be losing $16. Well, here's the thing. First of all, let's understand how this would actually work in real life instead of just boom, the price is doubled. And then take a look at the economic impact, right? So what would really more than likely happen over time is that one doesn't go from where it is to doubling in price, and the other one holding constant. There's an ebb and flow, and during that ebb and flow of, right, all you're seeing is these transactions happening, right? Maybe it's $1,000 in one direction, or I'm sorry, 1,000 tokens in one direction, 1,000 in the other, or 1,200 in one direction, 1,400 in the other, whatever the case is through this process. So the dollar value of fees can be substantially larger than what the impermanent loss is. Right? Not all the time, but then all you have to do is put your thinking cap on, like the magic school bus, right? You put your thinking cap on for a second, you smile, and you realize that there's other things involved here, because if intelligent people are going through and providing liquidity, then clearly it's not a bad option, right? Like they're clearly making money enough to do it, or there's another benefit by increasing the liquidity in the market that they get to benefit from. When you think about what happens when liquidity increases, there's other things that provides. If you think about, like, I'm trying to think of a good example for this, but there's a effect like a ripple effect when you have increases in liquidity on prices, and that those prices are not just in the direct pair of, say, Pulse and Pulsex. If you have a increase in liquidity, there's a correlation between other things that have a positive or a negative correlation. Probably positive because they're all in crypto, right? So there's going to be some positive level of correlation between these things. So you would have a ripple effect. So there's people who are going to do it just because they're earning fees. There's going to be people who are doing it because there's a ripple effect on their other assets or things that they're doing, and that ripple effect is greater. There's going to be people who are doing it because they want to have income, right? And the only time impermanent loss is real is when you sell. It's the only time. So the other, you can utilize this to generate fees, and if you think for a longer period of time that, okay, there's bear runs, right? I'm sorry, and there's bear and bull times in the market. So during a bull time, maybe the impermanent loss looks like it's, instead of $17, maybe what if you had hundreds of thousands of dollars or a couple $1 million in there, right? And it's like $1.7 million that you impermanent loss, right? You're like, oh, that's pretty substantial. Well, that's only at that peak in the moment, that specific snapshot in time. It doesn't include all the fees generated throughout that journey, or that what if that person just sits on that and waits for a bear market, right? As the bear market comes in, maybe that ratio comes back down. All this does is equal out over time, because think about this, we went in one direction, which means that there's an impermanent loss. We had 10,000 Pulse, that doubled in price. Now we only have 7,000 of that doubled in price. So clearly we're not going to make as much money. But if it goes in the other direction, if Pulse comes down and Pulsex comes up, that ratio could just even out, and the person can just be opportunistic in the way that they withdraw any type of liquidity from the market. And they also could take out fees, right? So say once a month they pull out fees that have been generated from providing liquidity, and they are purchasing the thing that's going up in price, right? Like there's many different ways to think about this, but when, like, it's not just going to be right or wrong, but there's many different ways to go about thinking about how this is going to be the case. And when you're like, if you see something happening in the market that you don't understand, you're like, that seems so foolish, right? Remember that, like, most people are relatively rational in their behavior in terms of doing things that are in their own best self-interest. So people are going to do things in their own best interest from an economic standpoint. And if you see other people doing things from that standpoint, and you don't understand that, you think it's foolish. And I'm not trying to give this guy a hard time. Like, I appreciate the question. It's awesome. Is that because I'm sure I've been in that place in the past, and that's probably why I was able to see this and even be able to, like, articulate this now. Is that other people see things that we don't see, and they're clearly benefiting in some way, because otherwise they wouldn't do it on average. People just wouldn't do it. If the fees were too low or they weren't making enough money, people would just not do it, right? And you don't have to take the money out, so you don't have to realize this loss. It's like an unrealized loss or unrealized gain kind of thing. As long as you have your liquidity in there, it's still in there, and it can ebb and flow in either direction. So hopefully this video was helpful in bringing those two pieces together. If it was, take a second, share it with somebody else trying to grow the channel. I've got lots of other videos related to this where we dive in a little bit deeper, talk more about the details. What about financial freedom? Did you know that there's a Trinity study that shows you can pull about 4% out of your portfolio safely without actually touching your principal balance? So what if you applied that type of thinking to crypto, something like Hex, where you could earn 38+% just interest, not assuming that there's any price appreciation? Then things can get really crazy, right? You can check out that or Pulsex video that I did the other day. Financial freedom is on the thumbnail, and you can go figure out that it allows you to create a much get to financial freedom in a much faster way than would be in the traditional world of stocks and bonds. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, you can check out the links down below as well. Say what's up on Twitter. Check out the other YouTube channel or jump over to Instagram. Appreciate you. Peace.